The sun had just started to rise above the small town when Robert stepped into the diner. The morning was cool and the air outside carried the smell of wet grass. Inside the diner was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and buttered toast. A soft tune played from the old radio near the counter, and the faint sound of pans clattering came from the kitchen. Robert, a man of 90 years, moved slowly but firmly toward his usual booth in the corner. His shoulders were slightly bent, his hair white as snow, and his skin carried the marks of a long life. Yet his eyes, sharp and clear, still held the spirit of a man who had seen the world in ways few others had. He wore a simple brown jacket and a flat cap, clothes that showed no sign of wealth but plenty of care. The waitress, Maria, noticed him at once. She had worked at the diner for only a year, but she already knew Robert's routine. Every morning he ordered the same meal, 2 eggs, toast, and black coffee. She smiled and greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Robert." "The usual?" Robert gave a small nod. "Yes, thank you, Maria. The usual will be just fine." His voice was soft yet steady. As he settled in, the diner remained peaceful. A few other early customers sat at tables reading newspapers or sipping coffee. It was the kind of calm morning Robert enjoyed, simple and quiet. He never asked for much. After all, he had spent much of his youth in places where peace was rare. But the peace did not last long. The door opened with a sudden push, and 4 police officers walked in. They were young, dressed neatly in their uniforms, and carried themselves with the pride of authority. Their voices were louder than necessary, and their laughter broke the gentle silence of the diner. Most customers quickly lowered their eyes, hoping not to attract attention. The officers ordered no food at first. Instead, they scanned the diner, speaking among themselves in low tones. Soon one of them pointed toward Robert's booth. The others followed his gaze, and smirks appeared on their faces. With an air of arrogance, they began to walk toward him. Robert looked up as they approached. His expression stayed calm, almost unreadable, but inside he already understood what was about to happen. This was not the first time in his long life that strangers had tried to test his patience. One officer pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking. Another leaned against the booth, folding his arms. The other 2 stood nearby, their presence heavy and intrusive. The customers around the diner grew silent, their eyes flickering nervously between Robert and the officers. "What are you doing here, old man?" asked the officer sitting across from him. His voice carried a sharp edge, not of curiosity but of challenge. Robert placed his fork gently on his plate and replied, "I am having my breakfast, same as anyone else." The officer chuckled, turning to his partners as if he had just heard a joke. Then he leaned forward. "You don't belong here. People like you should know better than to take up space where you're not wanted." Maria froze behind the counter. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the coffee pot. She wanted to step in, but fear kept her rooted in place. She could see the unfairness of the moment, yet she also knew the risk of speaking against officers in uniform. The diner grew tense. Customers shifted in their seats, whispering quietly but never loud enough to be heard. No one wanted to draw attention. All eyes, however, were on Robert. He looked at the officer calmly, showing no anger. His voice was steady when he answered, "Son, I have every right to sit here and enjoy my meal." The officer smirked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that so? And what makes you think anyone here cares about your rights?" Robert reached for his napkin, wiped his mouth carefully, and then placed it neatly beside his plate. He did not raise his voice, nor did he show fear. Instead, a small smile touched his lips, the kind of smile that came from someone who carried quiet confidence. "I have lived longer than you can imagine," he said slowly. "I have faced storms you cannot understand, and I can make one simple phone call that will change your morning very quickly." The officers exchanged confused looks. To them, he was just an old man sitting in a booth. They could not imagine that a man like him could hold any power. Robert leaned back against the seat. His smile did not fade, and his eyes remained fixed on the officer across from him. His calmness unsettled them, though they tried not to show it. The room stayed heavy with silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the radio and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. Every customer waited, wondering what would happen next, as the officers stood unsure of how to respond to the confidence of the man they thought would be weak. The young officer sitting across from Robert tapped his fingers on the table. His smirk stayed, but his eyes showed a hint of unease. He had expected the old man to tremble, to argue, or perhaps to quietly leave. Instead, Robert's calmness unsettled him. He leaned closer and said, "One phone call, huh? And who exactly are you going to call? The mayor? Your neighbor? Or maybe some old friend who can scare us?" Robert did not blink. His gaze was steady and his tone carried no fear. "The place I will call is not the mayor's office, and it is not any neighbor. It is far above that." The officer laughed, throwing his head back. His partners joined in with short bursts of laughter, but it sounded forced. They wanted to show the customers they were in control, yet something about the old man's quiet confidence made them uneasy. Maria stood at the counter, gripping the coffee pot tightly. She could feel her heart racing. She did not know much about Robert, only that he came every morning without fail. But now she wondered if there was more to his life than he ever let on. One of the officers standing nearby decided to push further. He leaned down and said, "Listen here, old man. You don't scare us. You're 90 years old, eating eggs in a small diner. You're nobody. So why don't you finish up and leave before we decide you're causing trouble?" The diner grew even quieter. Customers barely moved, as though any sound might break the fragile balance in the room. Robert, however, remained calm. He picked up his coffee cup, took a small sip, and placed it down carefully. "You think I am nobody," Robert said softly, "but the truth is, you know nothing about me. You see an old man with white hair and wrinkled skin. You do not see the years of service, the sacrifices, the battles I have lived through. You do not see the places I have been or the people I have stood beside." The officer frowned, unsure how to respond. Robert's words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were true. At that moment, a man sitting near the window lowered his newspaper. He was in his 60s with gray hair and glasses. He looked at Robert with recognition in his eyes. "Wait a minute," the man said quietly. "Are you Robert James? From the 101st? Robert turned his head slowly and gave the man a nod. "Yes, that was a long time ago." Gasps went around the diner. The man at the window put down his paper completely. "I remember reading about you," he said. "You were decorated for service. I thought you had moved away years ago." The officers exchanged looks. They had not expected anyone to recognize the old man. For the first time, their confidence wavered. Robert looked back at the officer sitting across from him. "I do not need to boast about who I am. My record speaks for itself, and if I pick up my phone right now, I can reach people who sit in offices much higher than you can imagine, people who answer to the Pentagon itself." The words hung heavy in the air. The officers did not laugh this time. The smirks faded from their faces, replaced by doubt. Maria finally found her voice. She set down the coffee pot and stepped forward. "He's telling the truth," she said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "I don't know everything about him, but I've heard stories. People in town say he served in places most of us can't even imagine. He's not just some old man." The lead officer frowned, trying to hold on to authority. "Even if that's true, it doesn't mean he can sit here and do whatever he wants." Robert leaned forward slightly, his eyes firm. "I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for respect, and respect is something every person deserves, no matter their age or their history. But if you insist on challenging me, then I will make that call, and you will see how quickly your world changes." The diner stayed still, the silence almost loud. Customers stared, Maria's hands trembled at her sides, and the officers hesitated. The young officer, who had been the loudest, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had never been in a situation like this. He wanted to push back, but something in Robert's steady eyes held him back. Finally, one of the officers whispered, "Maybe we should just let it go. He's just eating breakfast." But the lead officer was stubborn. He slammed his hand lightly on the table and said, "You think you can threaten us with a phone call? Go ahead, old man. Let's see what happens." Robert reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The diner held its breath. He pulled out a small black phone, placed it on the table, and pressed a single button. The screen lit up, showing a name at the top. Without hesitation, he brought it to his ear. The officers stared, unsure if they should laugh or worry. Robert's calm voice broke the silence. "This is Robert James. Put me through to the Pentagon, please." The diner erupted in whispers. Every customer turned, watching in disbelief. The officers froze, realizing the situation was no longer in their control. Robert sat back in his booth, holding the phone to his ear. His eyes never left the officers. He spoke. The diner had never been so quiet. Even the radio seemed softer, as if the music itself knew not to interrupt the moment. Robert sat with the phone to his ear, his calm voice steady as he waited for the line to connect. Every eye in the room was on him, from the curious customers to the officers who had moments ago carried themselves with such authority. Maria held her breath behind the counter. She had worked enough mornings at the diner to know when small dramas happened, but nothing like this had ever unfolded in front of her. She wanted to believe Robert, yet even she wondered if an old man could really make a call to the Pentagon. The phone clicked. A voice came through, professional and crisp. "Pentagon operator, how may I direct your call?" Robert's expression did not change. "This is Colonel Robert James, retired. I need to speak with General Hawkins." "Tell him it is urgent," the diner gasped again. Whispers spread quickly. "Colonel, General." These were not words anyone expected to hear in their small-town diner on a quiet morning. The officers shifted uneasily. The lead officer forced a laugh, though his voice cracked slightly. "You expect us to believe that? Anyone can pretend to be important on the phone." Robert ignored him. He kept the phone pressed to his ear. A pause followed, and then the voice returned. "One moment, Colonel. Connecting you now." The lead officer's face stiffened. His partners exchanged nervous glances. Maria felt a chill run through her arms. The man was not pretending. After a short silence, a deep, commanding voice came through the speaker. "Robert James, my old friend." "What an honor. To what do I owe the call?" Robert's lips curved into a small smile. "Good morning, Hawkins. I apologize for disturbing your schedule. I am sitting in a diner enjoying my breakfast, but I have been interrupted. Some young officers here seem to believe I do not belong." The diner went completely still. Every person could hear the voice on the phone, strong and clear. "Interrupted?" the general said. "By whom?" Robert glanced at the officers around him. His tone remained calm. "By 4 local police officers who appear to have forgotten the meaning of respect." The lead officer's face turned red. He stammered. "He's exaggerating." "We were just—" The voice on the phone cut in sharply. "Who is speaking?" "Identify yourself," the officer froze. His confidence drained as quickly as it had arrived. He could not bring himself to answer. Robert leaned back against the booth. "Do not worry about names right now, Hawkins. I only wanted them to understand that respect is not optional. Perhaps you can help me remind them." The general's voice grew firmer. "Robert, you gave this nation your years, your courage, and your honor. You earned the respect of every soldier who ever wore a uniform. Anyone who dares speak against you does so against the very service you stood for." "Put the phone on speaker." Robert pressed the button. Now every person in the diner could hear. The general's voice filled the room, strong and unshakable. "Officers, you are standing in front of a man who fought for freedoms you enjoy today. He is not just a veteran. He is a decorated hero who answered his country when it needed him most. You owe him respect and you owe him gratitude. If I hear that you have treated him poorly again, I will personally see to it that consequences follow." "Do I make myself clear?" The diner shook with silence once more. The officers stared at the phone, their confidence completely gone. The lead officer opened his mouth, but only a weak "Yes, sir," escaped. The general continued. "Good, Robert, my friend, enjoy your breakfast. And know that you are never alone. If anyone questions your place again, you call me. I will make sure they understand who you are." Robert gave a gentle nod, though the general could not see it. "Thank you, Hawkins. That is all I needed. Goodbye for now." "Goodbye, Colonel," the general replied, and the line clicked off. Robert placed the phone back on the table. His movements were steady, unhurried, as though nothing unusual had just happened. The officers stood frozen, their faces pale. The customers looked at Robert with new eyes, whispering quietly about what they had just witnessed. Maria finally exhaled. She stepped closer to Robert's booth. "Sir," she said softly, "was that really the Pentagon?" Robert looked up at her with the same calm smile. "Yes, Maria. That was an old friend checking in." The lead officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "We did not mean any harm. We just—" Robert raised his hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "Young man, I do not need excuses. What I need is for you to learn something today. Respect is not about age or power or uniforms. It is about recognizing the worth in every person you meet. If you carry authority, then carry it with dignity. Do not use it to belittle others." The words sank deep. The officers lowered their heads slightly, ashamed. The customers, once too afraid to speak, now began to clap softly. It started with the man by the window, then spread across the diner. Soon the room filled with the sound of hands coming together, not in noise but in respect for the man sitting quietly at the corner booth. Robert did not bask in it. He simply picked up his fork and returned to his eggs as if the applause meant little. For him, it was not about glory. It was about the lesson. And in that small diner on that quiet morning, everyone knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The sound of clapping slowly faded, but the respect remained heavy in the air. Robert sat quietly in his booth, taking small bites of his breakfast as though nothing unusual had just happened. To him, this was just another morning. But for the others in the diner, it had become a moment they would carry in their memories for a long time. The 4 officers still stood near his table. Their confidence had melted away. The lead officer shifted on his feet, his pride wounded, his cheeks still red. He opened his mouth again, hoping to recover some sense of control. Robert, we did not realize who you were. We only wanted to check things. Robert looked up at him slowly, his eyes calm but firm. You did not need to realize who I was. My name, my history, my rank should not have been necessary for you to offer respect. A person deserves it simply because they are a person. What you gave me instead was arrogance. You must learn the difference. The officer lowered his head, unable to meet Robert's gaze. His partner stayed silent, clearly unsure of what to say. They had walked in with loud laughter, but now they stood like children who had been corrected by a teacher. Maria stepped closer, her voice careful. Robert, would you like me to bring you another coffee? It's on the house. Robert gave her a kind smile. Thank you, Maria, that would be nice. She hurried off, grateful for something to do. The tension in the room was still thick, and she hoped the simple act of serving him coffee might ease the atmosphere. At one of the nearby tables, the man with the gray hair who had recognized Robert leaned forward. Colonel James, he said with respect, I remember reading about your service. You were part of one of the most difficult missions during the war, weren't you? Robert paused before answering. He did not like to talk about his past. Yes, he said finally, his voice low. But those were different times. I was younger then. The world needed people willing to step forward. I did what I had to do, nothing more. The man shook his head. Don't downplay it. People like you carried this country when it mattered most. These young officers should feel honored to even stand near you. Robert's eyes softened. Everyone serves in their own way. Do not put one person above another. I gave my service, but so do teachers, workers, mothers, fathers. Each carries a weight that matters. The man nodded quietly, touched by the humility in Robert's words. By now, Maria had returned with fresh coffee. She placed the cup carefully on the table, and Robert thanked her politely. Then, turning his gaze back to the officers, he spoke again. I will tell you something important. The uniform you wear is not for power. It is for service. When you put it on, you do not rise above others. You stand beside them, ready to protect, not to mock. Do you understand? The officers nodded slowly, shame written on their faces. The lead officer finally whispered, We understand. We were wrong. We apologize. Robert studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good, an apology is the first step. But remember, an apology means little if not followed by change. Let this morning be the day you decide to act differently. The silence in the diner shifted, no longer heavy but thoughtful. Customers who had once been afraid now seemed proud to have witnessed the exchange. A few smiled at Robert, grateful for the lesson he had given not only to the officers but to everyone present. A young boy sitting with his parents tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, Who is he, Mama? His mother leaned down and answered softly, He's someone who gave everything for others. That's why we should listen to him. Robert overheard the words, and a gentle warmth touched his heart. He never wanted fame, but moments like this reminded him that sometimes one life could inspire many, even without meaning to. As the officers prepared to leave, Robert called out to them one last time. Gentlemen, they turned, waiting. His tone was not sharp, but it carried weight. Next time you enter a room, remember that authority is not measured by how loud you are or how much fear you create. It is measured by the trust you build. Choose wisely how you carry yourselves. The officers nodded again, then walked out of the diner quietly, a very different group from the one that had entered. The customers followed them with their eyes, and the morning sun was brighter now. spreading golden light across the quiet street as Robert stepped out of the diner. He walked slowly but with steady steps, his cap tilted slightly forward. For him, the day felt like any other. Yet inside the diner, the air was still buzzing with what had just happened. Maria cleared the plates from Robert's booth, her hands still shaking a little. She could not stop thinking about the moment when Robert had called the Pentagon and spoken directly to a general. The sound of that commanding voice still echoed in her mind. She realized she had just witnessed something she would tell her children one day. Inside the diner, the gray-haired man who had recognized Robert leaned toward the others at his table. "That man is a true hero," he said quietly. "I read about him years ago. He was part of missions most soldiers would not survive, and now he sits here every morning as if he is just one of us." The customers nodded. Some looked toward the window, watching Robert as he made his way down the street. A sense of respect lingered in the room, stronger than before. Meanwhile, the 4 officers walked quickly to their patrol car parked outside. None of them spoke at first. Their faces were tight, their pride hurt, and their thoughts restless. The lead officer finally broke the silence. "We made fools of ourselves in there, that man. He made one call and suddenly we were the ones on the spot." Another officer sighed. He didn't even raise his voice. "That's what makes it worse. He stayed calm, and we were the ones who looked weak." The youngest of the group, who had laughed the loudest earlier, rubbed his forehead. "Do you think he'll report us? If the Pentagon knows our names, we're finished." The lead officer shook his head. "Maybe, maybe not. But I know this much, what he said was right. We wear this uniform for service, not power. We forgot that this morning." For a while they sat in the car, each lost in thought. The morning had started with laughter and swagger, but now it had turned into a lesson none of them would forget. Back inside the diner, Maria tried to bring life back into the room. She refilled coffee cups, smiled at customers, and asked if anyone needed more toast. Yet even with her cheerful effort, the mood remained reflective. People kept whispering about Robert, about his calmness, about the phone call that had silenced even the proud officers. The young boy who had asked about Robert tugged at his father's sleeve again. "Dad, can we be like him when we grow up?" His father smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We may not fight battles like he did, but we can show the same respect, the same courage, and the same calm. That is what makes someone like him." The boy nodded seriously, as though he had just learned an important secret about life. As the hours passed, word about the incident began to spread. Small towns carried news quickly, and before long people outside the diner were already talking. Some said the veteran had called Washington itself. Others said the police had been put in their place by a general's voice. And all agreed on one thing: Robert James was no ordinary old man. Robert, meanwhile, walked slowly back to his modest home a few streets away. His house was simple, a small place with a porch and a garden he tended every afternoon. He hung his jacket neatly by the door and set his cap on the table. Then he sat in his favorite chair, looking out the window at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He was not proud of what had happened. He had never enjoyed humiliating others, but he knew the officers needed to learn that lesson. Respect had to be taught even if the moment was uncomfortable. He closed his eyes for a while, letting the quiet of his home replace the tension of the diner. Later that afternoon, Maria knocked gently at his door. When Robert opened it, she stood there with a small box of pastries in her hands. "I thought you might like these," she said with a smile. "And I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did today, but for everything you've done before. People in town will remember this morning for a long time." Robert accepted the box with a polite nod. "Thank you, Maria. You did well too. I saw the way you stood even though you were afraid. That takes courage." She blushed slightly. "I didn't do much." "You did enough," Robert replied. "Sometimes courage is not in shouting or fighting. Sometimes it is in standing still when your heart is racing." Maria left with a lighter step, touched by his words. As evening approached, Robert sat back in his chair, sipping tea. He thought about the faces in the diner, the boy who had asked questions, the officers who had walked away changed. He realized that even at 90, his duty was not finished. Perhaps his battles were behind him, but his lessons still had value. And so, while the town whispered and the officers worried about their choices, Robert rested quietly, knowing he had lived his life with purpose. The phone sat on the table beside him, silent now but ready if ever needed again. The next morning the diner opened as usual, with the smell of coffee and pancakes drifting through the air. But something felt different. People came in not just for breakfast but also to see if the old veteran would return. Word had spread quickly through the small town, and curiosity brought even those who rarely visited the diner. Maria stood behind the counter, her apron neatly tied. She had not stopped thinking about the events of the day before. Every time she poured coffee, she pictured Robert sitting calmly while the officers tried to belittle him. She wondered if he would come again today. Part of her hoped he would, just so everyone could see with their own eyes what respect looked like. Around mid-morning, the door opened, and there he was. Robert James walked in slowly, wearing the same cap, his steps measured but steady. The room grew quiet as soon as people noticed him. Conversations faded and heads turned. Some nodded in greeting, others simply stared. It was as if a figure from history had stepped into their little diner. Maria rushed forward with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. James. Your booth is ready." Robert gave a small nod and walked toward his usual seat. He placed his cap gently on the table before sitting down. For him, this was routine, but for the crowd, it was something far greater. A young man approached him timidly. He held a notebook in his hand, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Sir, may I ask you a question?" Robert looked at him kindly. "Go ahead. Is it true you served in the war? That you were on missions no one else would take?" Robert studied the boy for a moment. "I served, yes. I did what was asked of me. Nothing more, nothing less," the young man pressed further. "But you must have been brave. How did you do it?" Robert leaned back in his seat. "Courage is not about not being afraid. It is about being afraid and still doing what needs to be done. Remember that." The young man wrote the words quickly in his notebook as though they were too precious to lose. Then he thanked Robert and stepped back, leaving others to watch in admiration. As the morning went on, more people came to greet Robert. Some shook his hand, others simply nodded respectfully. It was clear the town had begun to see him in a new light. He was no longer just the quiet old man in the corner booth. He had become a symbol, a living reminder of sacrifice and dignity. Meanwhile, across town, the 4 officers were called into the police chief's office. The chief was a tall, serious man who had already heard the story from multiple sources. He sat behind his desk, staring at them with a hard expression. "I heard what happened yesterday," the chief said slowly. "You embarrassed this department. More importantly, you disrespected a man who gave more to this country than most of us ever will." The officers shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to interrupt. The chief continued. "This town is small. News spreads fast. People are already talking and they are not on your side. You will fix this. You will show respect. And you will remember why you wear that badge." The lead officer spoke quietly. "Yes, sir?" "Good," the chief replied firmly. "Because if I hear another story like this, you will not be wearing that badge any longer." The officers left the office with heavy steps. They knew they had been given a second chance, and they would have to earn back the trust they had lost. Back at the diner, Robert finished his breakfast. Maria brought the check, but as always, someone else had already paid for his meal. This time it was the gray-haired man who had recognized him the day before. "It's the least I can do," the man said when Robert tried to refuse. Robert sighed softly but accepted the gesture with grace. He understood people wanted to give something back, even if it was just the price of breakfast. As he stood to leave, Maria stopped him. "Mr. James, the people here look up to you. They see more than just an old soldier. They see someone who stands for respect. Thank you for showing us that." Robert looked at her with gentle eyes. "Respect is not a gift, Maria. It is something we give freely, no matter who stands before us. That is how the world becomes better." With that, he placed his cap back on his head and walked slowly toward the door. The customers watched him leave in silence, their hearts touched by the simple truth of his words. That evening, Robert sat on his porch, the sky glowing with shades of orange and pink. He thought about the diner, about the young man with the notebook, about the chief who surely had spoken to the officers. Change, he knew, did not happen overnight, but even a small spark could light the way for others. As he rocked gently in his chair, he whispered to himself, "My battles may be over, but my lessons still matter." The quiet street around him grew darker as the stars appeared. In that moment, The following day started with bright sunlight and a cool breeze moving through the small town. People went about their usual morning routines, but the diner had a special energy in the air. Everyone wondered if Robert James would appear again. Maria arrived early, wiping down the tables and making sure everything looked neat. She had noticed how the mood in the diner had changed ever since Robert stood up to the officers. Customers no longer came just for breakfast. They came with a sense of expectation, as though they might learn something from the old veteran's quiet wisdom. Around 9 o'clock, the door opened and Robert walked in. His steps were steady, his face calm. He carried the same cap on his head, and he moved with the same quiet dignity. The diner once again fell silent for a moment before filling with whispers and nods of respect. "Good morning." "Mr. James," Maria greeted warmly. "Good morning." "Young lady," Robert replied with a small smile. He took his usual booth, placed his cap gently on the table, and looked out the window as though he were remembering a different time. Not long after he settled in, the door opened again. This time it was the 4 officers. They walked in together, but their energy was very different from the day they had mocked him. Their shoulders were tense and their expressions were serious. Customers watched carefully, waiting to see what would happen. The officers approached Robert's booth. For a moment, silence filled the air again. Then the lead officer cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, his voice quieter than anyone expected. "We came to apologize." Robert turned his eyes to the young man. He said nothing at first, waiting for the officer to continue. "We spoke to the chief," the officer went on. "We know what we did was wrong. We disrespected you, and we disrespected ourselves. We were arrogant. We thought we had the right to treat you poorly, but we were wrong." The other 3 nodded in agreement. Their voices joined in, each saying the same word. "Sorry." The diner was silent again. Everyone leaned forward, eager to hear Robert's reply. Robert rested his hands on the table and looked at them with calm eyes. "Apologies mean little if they are not followed by change," he said softly. The lead officer swallowed hard. "We understand. We want to do better. We want to show respect. We know you deserve it." Robert studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Respect is not something given because of age or rank. It is given because every person has worth. If you truly understand that, then perhaps you can still honor the badge you wear." The officers nodded again, their faces filled with relief and humility. The lead officer then extended his hand across the table. For a moment, the diner held its breath. Robert reached out his own hand and shook it firmly. The crowd exhaled together, and a ripple of soft applause filled the room. Maria felt her heart lift. She saw in that handshake something more powerful than any speech. It was forgiveness, but also a challenge for the officers to prove themselves worthy of it. After the handshake, the officers stepped back. They ordered their breakfast quietly, sitting at a table near the door. Their presence no longer carried arrogance. Instead, it carried the weight of a lesson learned. Robert returned to his meal. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, came up to him shyly. She held a small notebook in her hands. "Sir," she asked in a timid voice, "can I write about you for my school essay?" "The teacher said we should write about someone who inspires us." Robert smiled warmly. "You can write whatever you like, child. But remember, inspiration does not come from perfection. It comes from trying to do what is right." The girl grinned and hurried back to her table. Her parents looked on with pride, nodding their thanks to Robert. As the hours passed, the diner stayed busy. People came not only for food, but to see the man who had become the town's quiet teacher. Robert never bragged, never raised his voice. He simply shared small truths that came from a lifetime of experience. Later that afternoon, as Robert left the diner, the 4 officers were waiting outside. The lead officer spoke again. "Sir, if you don't mind, we'd like to escort you home today. Not because you need it, but because we want to show respect." Robert looked at them, then nodded. "If that is your choice, I will accept it." So the old veteran walked down the street, his cap resting on his head, while 4 uniformed officers followed a respectful distance behind. People along the road stopped to watch. Some clapped, others simply stood in silence. It was a scene no one in the town would forget. That night, Robert sat on his porch once more. The stars shone brightly overhead. He thought about the officers, the diner, and the little girl who wanted to write about him. He knew he did not have many years left, but he also knew that those years still carried meaning. As he closed his eyes, he whispered to himself, "Sometimes the smallest act of courage can teach the largest lesson." The world around him grew quiet, and Robert felt peace in knowing he had turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson of respect that would last far beyond him. The diner felt different in the days that followed. The booths were the same. The old jukebox still played soft tunes, and the smell of bacon and coffee still drifted through the air. But there was a new spirit inside. People talked more kindly to one another, smiles were easier to find, and the story of Robert James had become part of the town's memory. Robert continued his routine. Each morning he walked through the diner's doors with his slow but steady steps, his cap resting proudly on his head. Customers no longer just glanced his way. They greeted him warmly, shaking his hand or offering a nod of respect. Children often waved, and Robert always returned the gesture with a gentle smile. Maria noticed how his presence seemed to bring calm wherever he sat. Even when the diner grew crowded and noisy, his booth remained a quiet corner filled with a sense of order. She often found herself listening carefully when he spoke, because his words, though simple, carried weight. One morning, a group of students entered the diner with their teacher. They were working on a history project, and the teacher thought hearing from someone who had lived through so much would inspire them. The students gathered nervously near Robert's table until Maria encouraged them to go closer. "Mr. James," the teacher said respectfully, "would you mind speaking to these students about your life?" Robert set down his coffee cup and nodded. "I will share a little if they wish to listen." The students leaned forward, eager to hear. Robert began slowly, not boasting, but telling his story with honesty. He spoke of the days when he was young, when he wore the uniform and carried out missions far from home. He told them about the cold nights in foreign lands, the long marches, the sound of planes overhead, and the courage of those who stood beside him. But he also spoke of something deeper. "The greatest battles are not always fought with weapons," he said. "Sometimes they are fought with patience, with kindness, with the decision to stay calm when anger would be easier. Remember this, children. Strength is not only in the body, it is in the heart and mind." The students wrote quickly, hanging on every word. When he finished, they clapped softly, and the teacher thanked him with shining eyes. Maria felt tears forming in her own. That same afternoon, the 4 officers returned to the diner. Their uniforms looked crisp, and their attitudes had changed. They walked in quietly, not demanding attention, but offering greetings to customers as they passed. When they reached Robert's booth, they removed their hats. "Mr. James," the lead officer said, "we want to thank you again. You taught us something we should have already known. We've been trying to make it right, not only with you, but with everyone we serve. We want to let you know that your lesson has stayed with us." Robert looked at them with steady eyes. "If you truly understand that every person has worth, then you will wear your badges with honor. Remember, the uniform does not make the man. The choices you make do." The officers nodded firmly. They left after finishing their meal, but their quiet respect showed everyone that real change was possible. In the weeks that followed, the town began to change as well. People looked at one another differently. There was less harshness in voices, more patience in daily life. It was as if Robert's calm courage had spread beyond the diner walls and touched the whole community. One evening, Maria stayed late to close up. She found Robert still sitting at his booth, looking out the window at the setting sun. She walked over, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "You've changed this town, Mr. James," she said softly. Robert shook his head.
"I did nothing special."
"I simply stood when others tried to push me down. Anyone can do the same. It is not about age or history or medals. It is about remembering that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. And I will never surrender mine." Maria felt a deep respect swell in her heart. She realized that his presence was not just about his past. It was about the way he carried himself in the present. When Robert finally stood to leave, she noticed how the customers in the diner quietly rose to their feet. No one had planned it, but all seemed to understand. They stood because he deserved it. They stood because respect is shown not only in words but in actions. Robert paused at the door, his cap resting firmly on his head. He looked back once more at the room filled with faces. Some were young, some were old, but all were touched by his strength. "Take care of each other," he said simply. "That is the greatest service of all." Then he walked out into the evening air,